The ad said pilot, experienced, reasonable rates, no long-term commitment required. That was all. No credentials listed, no service history, no reference to the kind of experience or the kind of reasonable or what the pilot considered a long-term commitment. Just those 4 lines, posted on the Conclave's General Labor Exchange in the section that Vethara Station's commercial operators checked when they needed someone to fly something somewhere and did not have anyone available to do it. Merchant Captain Sierra Ken had been checking that section for 3 days. She had been checking it because her regular pilot had taken a medical posting on the Inner Systems run and would not be back for 4 months, and she had a cargo contract that started in 6 days, and that paid enough to make losing it a problem she did not want to have. She had found 4 listings in 3 days. 3 of them had been immediately disqualifying for reasons that she had identified within the first exchange message, the kind of reasons that experienced operators recognized without needing to be burned by them. The 4th was the ad that said pilot, experienced, reasonable rates, no long-term commitment required. She sent a message. The response came back in 4 minutes, which was fast enough to suggest the person was available and not so fast as to suggest they were desperate, a distinction that her 12 years of hearing contractors had taught her to read. The response said, "I am available. What is the cargo, the route, and the timeline?" Not, "I am very interested in your posting." Not, "I would be happy to discuss the opportunity." Not any of the framing that contractors who wanted the work badly enough to soften their position used at the beginning of a negotiation. What is the cargo, the route, and the timeline? She wrote back with the cargo, the route, and the timeline. The response came back in 7 minutes. It said, "The route is manageable. The cargo classification requires a Class 4 transport certification which I hold. The timeline works. My rate is standard plus 15% for the hazard designation on the secondary waypoint. If that is acceptable, I can meet you at Vethara Station's Commercial Dock 7 tomorrow at 800. She looked at the rate. Standard plus 15% was reasonable. The hazard designation on the secondary waypoint was real, and she had been expecting a higher premium for it from any contractor who knew what they were looking at. Standard plus 15% meant the pilot knew what the hazard designation meant and was pricing it at the low end of what it warranted. She wrote acceptable, 800 Dock 7. She arrived at 7:59. He was already there. Not because he had been early in a way that was trying to communicate something. Because he had been there, she would learn later, since 700, having walked the dock to understand the vessel configuration before the meeting, the kind of preparation that experienced pilots did as a matter of course without needing to announce it. He was human. She had not known this from the exchange messages, because the exchange messages did not include species designation, and she had not asked, and it had not occurred to her to ask because it was not a variable she had considered relevant. She had hired contractors of 17 different species in 12 years of operating, and species had not been the relevant variable in any of those hirings. The relevant variables were capability and reliability, and the specific quality that was harder to name, but that she looked for in the first 2 minutes of any first meeting, which was whether the person in front of her was actually what they presented as. He was standing at the dock access point with a small bag and a tablet, and the quality she looked for. He was human, medium height, the age that humans reached when they had been doing something for long enough to show it without being old enough to show stopping. She could not have given a number to the age by looking at him. The number was in the eyes, which were the eyes of someone who had processed a significant quantity of experience and had organized it in a way that had produced stillness rather than the alternative. She said, "Captain Ken." He said, "Juno, just Juno." Not pilot Juno, not contractor Juno, just Juno in the way that people who had been called many things settled on the one that was most accurate. She said, "Have you seen the manifest?" He said, I reviewed the cargo documentation you sent last night. The Class 4 classification is correct. The secondary waypoint hazard is navigational rather than environmental, which is why I priced it at the low end. It is a problem of routing, not of conditions. I have routed through that designation before. She said, when? He said, a few years ago. She said, professionally. He said, yes. She said, what were you carrying? He said, something else. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the stillness. She said, dock access is keyed. I will add you to the system. The vessel is a Class 4 transport, 12 years old, well-maintained. The maintenance logs are current. He said, I reviewed those too. You had the secondary drive manifold replaced 14 months ago. Good choice on the timing. She said, the listing said experienced. He said, I'm experienced. She said, the listing said reasonable rates. He said, standard plus 15 is reasonable for that route. She said, it is. That is why I hired you. She keyed his access and walked him to the vessel, and showed him the systems, and watched him look at the systems with the attention of someone who was not reviewing them for the first time, but was reviewing this specific vessel's implementation of systems he already understood. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were the questions that a pilot who understood the system deeply asked, not the surface questions that a pilot learning the system asked. The questions about the specific tolerances on the secondary drive manifold and the fuel cell cycling protocol and the emergency navigation backup. She answered them. He nodded. He said, I will run a pre-flight this afternoon. We can depart on schedule. She said, the pre-flight takes most pilots half a day. He said, yes. She said, I have not told you it takes half a day. He said, I know how long pre-flight takes on a Class 4 transport with a recently replaced secondary drive manifold. She looked at him for a moment. She said, I will be aboard at 1700. She was aboard at 1658. He was in the pilot's seat, running the final pre-flight checks. The departure went without incident. Departures going without incident were what she paid for, and she had had enough incidents in 12 years to know that without incident was not as automatic as people who had not had incidents assumed. Without incident was the product of competence applied consistently, which was what she looked for, and was usually what she got from contractors who matched the first meeting assessment and Juno had matched. The route was 7 days. 7 days was long enough to know whether the assessment had been accurate. The assessment had been accurate. He flew the route with the specific economy of someone for whom flying was not a performance but a function, who did not do anything unnecessary, and did not fail to do anything necessary, and whose relationship with the vessel's systems was the relationship of someone who had been in enough vessels to understand what a vessel was underneath its specific configuration, and who dealt with the vessel at that level rather than at the level of the specific controls in front of him. She found herself in the cockpit more than she usually spent time in the cockpit on a cargo run, which she noticed and attributed to the route, which had enough navigational interest to make the cockpit more engaging than the cargo hold, and which she later understood was something else. On the 3rd day, in the long quiet of the interstellar transit between the first and second waypoints, she was in the cockpit with a drink, and he was running a minor recalibration on the navigation array that he had identified in the previous night's system check, and that she would not have noticed for another week. She said, "You said a few years ago for the secondary waypoint route." He said, "Yes." She said, "The designation was changed 3 years ago. Before the change, it was a different classification." He said, "I know." She said, "Before the change, the route through that area was a military corridor." He said, "Yes." She said, "You said you routed through it professionally." He said, "Yes." She said, "What kind of professional routes through a military corridor?" He looked at the navigation array for a moment. He said, the military kind. She said, you were military. He said, I was. She said, Earth military. He said, yes. She said, the route was a military corridor 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Earth military was active in that region. That was during the Deadliest corridor conflict. He said nothing. She said, the Deadliest corridor conflict ended 2 years and 4 months ago. He said, yes. She said, what were you doing there? He looked at the navigation array. He said, my job. She looked at him. She said, the Deadliest corridor conflict lasted 7 years. He said, yes. She said, Earth entered in the final phase. He said, yes. She said, you were in the final phase. He said, I was in more than the final phase. She looked at him. He said it without looking at her, still looking at the navigation array, in the tone of someone who was correcting a factual inaccuracy rather than disclosing something. She said, how much more? He said, most of it. She said, the Deadliest corridor conflict ran for 7 years. Earth entered formally in year 6. He said, Earth entered formally in year 6. She held the distinction he was making. She said, and informally. He said, informally is a word for it. She looked at him for a long time. He finished the recalibration. He said, the array was off by a margin that would have compounded over the remaining 4 days. It is corrected now. She said, what does informally mean? He said, it means there are things that happen before formal entry that are not in the formal record. She said, you were in those things. He said, I was. She said, for how long? He was quiet for a moment. He said, for long enough. She said, the conflict killed 900 million people on the original trajectory before the ceasefire. He said, yes. She said, the ceasefire held. He said, yes. She said, do you know why it held? He said, I know some of the reasons. She said, what reasons do you know? He said, I know the reasons that were visible from where I was. The reasons that were visible from where I was were not the diplomatic reasons or the framework reasons. They were the reasons on the ground. The reasons in the specific places where the trajectory was going and where people were working to change it before the trajectory reached them. She said, you were in those specific places. He said, some of them. She said, doing what? He said, what needed to be done. She said, that is a very precise non-answer. He looked at her for the first time since she had started asking. He said, I know. She held his gaze. She said, the listing said no long-term commitment required. He said, yes. She said, was that for me or for you? He was quiet for a moment. He said, for me. She said, why? He said, because I am not in a place where long-term commitment is something I can accurately assess. I do not know what the next 6 months look like. I know what the next 7 days look like. That is the range I can commit to accurately. She said, that is honest. He said, I try. She said, the 7 years before the formal entry, what were you doing? He said, the same thing I am doing now in a different context. Moving things from where they were to where they needed to be, finding routes that were available when the obvious routes were not, understanding systems well enough to use them in conditions they were not designed for. She said, flying. He said, flying. She said, under what authority? He looked at the navigation display. He said, under the authority of the situation requiring it. She said, that is not a military authority. He said, no. She said, was there a military authority? He said, not one I was attached to formally. She said, but you were military. He said, I had been before. She said, before what? He said, before the situation required the other thing. She looked at him. She said, The other thing was flying cargo through a military corridor, informally for 7 years, during a conflict that killed 900 million people on the original trajectory. He said, among other things. She sat with that. She said, the listing said no long-term commitment required. I assumed that meant you were between postings, between contracts. He said, I am between postings. She said, but the posting you were in was not a contract. He said, no. She said, what was it? He was quiet for a long time. The interstellar transit was quiet around them, the specific quiet of open space between waypoints where the only sounds were the vessel's systems and the two of them. He said, the conflict killed 900 million people on the original trajectory. It did not kill 900 million people. It killed a number that is significantly smaller than 900 million. The difference between the original trajectory and the actual outcome is the sum of everything that was done in the gap between what the conflict was going to be and what it became. He looked at the display. He said, I was in the gap. For 7 years I was in the gap between what the conflict was going to be and what it became. Not alone. There were others, but I was in it. She said, doing what? He said, moving things. Finding routes, understanding systems well enough to use them in conditions they were not designed for, getting to places that needed something brought to them and bringing it, getting information from places that had it to the places that needed it, being where the gap was and doing what the gap required. She said, for 7 years. He said, yes. She said, under no formal authority. He said, under the authority of 900 million people on a trajectory that someone needed to be in the gap for. She held that. She said, the conflict ended 2 years and 4 months ago. He said, yes. She said, and you are flying cargo for standard plus 15%. He said, yes. She said, why? He looked at the navigation display for a long time. He said, because the cargo needs to get from where it is to where it needs to be, because the route is manageable, because the rate is reasonable. She said, that is not why. He said, no. She said, why? He was quiet for a long time. He said, because I have been in the gap for 7 years. I have been moving through places that were in the gap, doing what the gap required in conditions that the gap produced, and the gap is closed. The conflict ended. The trajectory changed. The 900 million became the smaller number because the gap was filled. He paused. He said, and I do not know what I am outside the gap. I know what I am in it. I know how to find the routes that are available when the obvious routes are not. I know how to use systems in conditions they were not designed for. I know how to be where something is needed and do what it requires. I know all of that very well. He said, I do not know what that is when the gap is not there. When the conflict is over and the trajectory has changed, and the 900 million is the smaller number, and there is nothing that requires what I know how to do. He said, so I fly cargo, because the cargo needs to get from where it is to where it needs to be, because that is a version of what I know how to do that has a rate and a route and a timeline. 7 days. Manageable. The cockpit was quiet. She held her drink and looked at the navigation display and thought about what he had said, and what he had not said and the space between the two. She said, the others. You said there were others in the gap. He said, yes. She said, where are they? He said, some of them are doing what I am doing. Some of them found the other thing. Some of them did not find either. She said, the ones who did not find either. He said, the gap takes things from people. 7 years of it takes specific things. Some of them did not have what was left when the gap closed. That is not a failure. It is the cost of 7 years in the gap. She said, what did it take from you? He said, specificity. I know how to do the thing. I do not know how to do the thing in the context of a life that is not the thing. The gap was total. Everything was the gap. Outside the gap I have the capability and not the context. She said, and the cargo run gives you context. He said, the cargo run gives me a route and a timeline. That is a version of context. It is enough for 7 days. She looked at him. She said, you are looking for the next gap. He was quiet. He said, I am looking for what is outside the gap. I do not know if I will find it. I am finding the version of what I know how to do that has a rate and a route and a timeline, and seeing if that is enough or if it is a version of waiting. She said, waiting for what? He said, I do not know yet. She said, that is honest. He said, I try. She looked at the navigation display. She said, the secondary waypoint, the hazard designation. You said you routed through it before. He said, yes. She said, what were you carrying? He said, information. The kind that needed to get from where it was to where it was needed, and that could not go through the obvious route because the obvious route was not available. She said, to whom? He said, to the people who needed it to do what they were doing in the gap. She said, and it got there. He said, yes. She said, and what they were doing in the gap with the information you brought them. He said, is part of the reason the 900 million is the smaller number. She held that for a long time. The interstellar transit continued. The vessel's systems made their sounds. She said, after the 7 days. He said, yes. She said, if the cargo run is manageable and the rate holds. He said, yes. She said, I have 2 more contracts after this one. Same route, different cargo. The secondary waypoint designation has not changed. He said, no. She said, and the timeline. He said, what is the timeline? She said, 4 months. To cover the gap while my regular pilot is on the medical posting. He looked at the navigation display. He said, 4 months is longer than 7 days. She said, yes. He said, I said no long-term commitment. She said, 4 months is not long-term. It is a timeline. It has a start and an end. He was quiet. She said, you know the route. You know the secondary waypoint. You found the recalibration I would not have caught for a week. He said, yes. She said, the cargo needs to get from where it is to where it needs to be. He said, yes. She said, and the rate is reasonable. He said, standard plus 15 for the hazard designation. She said, standard plus 15. He looked at the navigation display for a long time. He said, 4 months. She said, 4 months. He said, and then. She said, and then your regular pilot is back and you are between postings again. He said, yes. She said, or not. He looked at her. She said, I have been operating for 12 years. My regular pilot has a medical posting that may extend beyond 4 months. I run these routes. I know the gap between the cargo and where it needs to be because I closed that gap for 12 years. It is a different gap than the one you were in. She said, but it is a gap. He looked at the navigation display. He said, it is a different gap. She said, yes. He said, the cargo needs to get where it is going. She said, yes. He said, and the route is manageable. She said, yes. He said, and the rate. She said, we can discuss the rate. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 4 months, and we discussed the rate. She said, 4 months, and we discussed the rate. He looked at the navigation display. She looked at the navigation display. The interstellar transit continued. The vessel moved through the space between waypoints. The systems made their sounds. Outside the cockpit window, the stars were where they were, and the route was the route, and the cargo was going where it needed to go. And the gap between where it was and where it needed to be was closing at the rate that the route allowed. Which was enough. For now. Which was what now usually was.